Hello everyone, my name is Preston Nieves. I'm the president of the Wisdom Factory Literary Society. And with me I have...
Nicholas Flores, hello. And I'm the research/writing director of the Wisdom Factory.
So Nicholas Flores, sometimes we call him Nicholas Maduro, Nicodemus, Nicodankus. We've been friends a long time, so we have a lot of different nicknames that, the Wisdom Factory, particularly myself, will use for Nick. So I guess it's safe to say we're somewhat creative with names, right?
I would say so.
Yeah, because he's come up with some stuff for me. President Snow, because my last name's Nieves. But you know who really was not creative with names?
Oh yeah?
Prussia.
Oh my God.
So look, so you go here and this book has all the names of the rulers of Prussia, and everybody's either Frederick or Wilhelm.
Of course.
Yeah, not original whatsoever. But what was original was Prussia's military tactics and strategies, and really just the way that they ran their state. And that is what we are going to be talking about today, the rise of Prussia. So for those of you who don't know what Prussia is, it was a state in Germany. And they originated, long before the unified state of Germany even existed. That they were their own independent country for a long time, and they led the way in unifying Germany and continued to be a federal state of Germany all the way up and through 1947. Then that was when they were dissolved by the Allies. In the beginning, and when Prussia actually begins and ends is a little bit contentious. So what time period are we actually talking about, Nick? So when we say Prussia, are we just talking about the state of Prussia, or are we including Germany? Sort of what time frame are we dealing with here?
Well, like you said, the end of Prussia is about 1947 as an entity. So that will be the end date. And then in terms of the beginning, well, depending on how you make the argument, we could go as far back as the Middle Ages, but for the sake of this discussion, we're going to say closer to the Principality of Brandenburg, the Duchy of Prussia, which was around the time of a little bit before the 30 Years' War.
Yeah, and also, so the way that this book actually puts it is that the time period we're usually concerned about when we're dealing with Prussia is around 1701 to 1947, because you're right that there was definitely stuff beforehand where they were starting to forge that identity, but 1701 really was that time when
it was truly Prussia is Prussia.
So what sort of situation was Prussia in at that time? Because to start, because Prussia didn't exist, during the 30 Years' War and that sort of stuff, and then 1701 they come around, and so one of the first questions we have is what situation was Prussia actually in? And that was interesting and somewhat ironic is that Prussia was actually a vassal of states that later on Germany would actually end up occupying, notably Poland. And then they were also, they were not, well, let me back up a little bit. They were not a continuous territory. They were a fragmented patchwork of different territories. Some of them were ruled by Poland, and then some of them were ruled by the Holy Roman Empire, which, that was still a thing back then. It got dissolved eventually.
If I remember right, it was the thinker, what was it, Montesquieu? That said that the Holy Roman Empire was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire.
Yeah, and Napoleon said that Prussia was hatched from a cannonball, which I definitely think was true, as we're going to get into. But it was really interesting because Prussia, so as we know, Prussia ended up becoming a great military power. That Prussia essentially expanded to conquer the other German states during the 1870s. And led to the German Empire, and then Nazi Germany eventually in World War II, a very formidable force. But at this time period, when you were to look at Prussia on the map, this is not really the type of country that you would think would have become a great power. I mean, not only were they a vassal state, but they were spread out all over the place. Like they were, at best a second-rate power, because they did have a decent military even going all the way back then. So maybe, they could have been formidable in certain circumstances, but they weren't really great power material based on the information that was then available.
Right.
But the first ruler, let me look, I need to get the names straight, dude. They all have the same freaking name. So Frederick Wilhelm, the Great Elector, from 1620 to 1688. Well, what happens with this was they created a little bit of a loophole for themselves over in Prussia. So when we talk about kings, right, we usually talk about like the king of something. There's the Queen of England, and there's the Queen of the Netherlands, or the King of France if you're dealing with
the Empress
Louis.
of Russia.
Yeah, the Empress of Russia. But they knew that if they did that, it would be an open challenge to the authority of the Poles and of the Holy Roman Empire. So what this first ruler decided to do was declare himself king in Prussia. So there was no king of Prussia. They were still a vassal, but they were the king in Prussia. And what this did was it allowed them to establish a degree of a Prussian identity without doing so in a way that was an open affront to the Poles and the Holy Roman Empire. Because in the 48 Laws of Power, one of the things it talks about is never outshine the master. You don't want to appear better than the person who's in charge of you, lest they retaliate out of envy or something like that. And that the Prussians understood that. But the Prussians were playing the long game here, because while they recognized that they were still a long way away from being an independent state, that they were able to create some semblance of a Prussian identity that was unique from the Poles, unique from the Holy Roman Empire, and established a sphere of political authority that was uniquely Prussian, even if it was subject to other countries. So do you have anything to add about that, Nick? What sort of situation was Prussia in towards the beginning of its existence?
Well, oddly enough, even though a state like Prussia was, to some historians, nicknamed the Sparta of the North, in the very beginning of its situation, it was anything from it. If we had to say what the state of it was before, for instance, Frederick Wilhelm, that you said, the king in Prussia, during this time, Prussia was on the northern European plain. What this means, basically, that there were no natural land barriers to protect itself. It was all flat land. So there was no way they can actually defend themselves first off. It was also, Prussia in the past was nicknamed as the sand land, or basically the soil was nothing but beach sand in essence. There were no natural resources such as coal, iron, steel, phosphorus, whatever. And because the soil was poor, it could not support that kind of population. And to top it all off, in the beginning, when it first became Prussia, it was, how do I put it, landlocked. The only time it wasn't landlocked was when it officially became Prussia, when they absorbed the Duchy of East Prussia, which was a fiefdom under the Poles.
Yeah.
So that's the general situation.
So fast forwarding a little bit, because basically the way we decided to structure this, we're going to talk about the history, then we're going to analyze policies that made Prussia great, and then talk about what we can learn from Prussian history in terms of today's politics, with strategies, tactics, that kind of thing. So fast forwarding to Prussia actually becoming independent. So, at a certain point it became an independent state. How did that actually happen?
Well then, what do you mean in terms of Prussia itself?
So the transition from just being king in Prussia to like having a Prussian state.
Okay.
That it wasn't Polish anymore. It wasn't the Holy Roman Empire anymore.
Well, by the time that it was the king in Prussia, they had already taken East Prussia at that point. So we're going to have to skip a little bit further in and say during the reign of Frederick the Great, the Soldaten, or that's German for the soldier king.
Well, actually, no, we're skipping one. It was William the First who was the soldier king, actually. So what happened?
My bad.
Yeah. So William the First. So what happened was that Prussia, in the early 1700s, was when they were really forming themselves as a military power. That they had become, independent. They were no longer vassals, but they were developing these, the structure and the capabilities that they would need to become great later on. And a lot of this had to do with reforms within the military. So William the First, Wilhelm in German, the first was the one who established the system and the military bureaucracy and everything that Frederick the Great actually ended up using in battle.
Yeah.
So there was a number of different reforms. But what happened was, you had the Royal Guard at the top. They were the most elite soldiers, and you also had the Grenadiers, and then you had the Musketeers, which were the majority of the troops. The Royal Guard and the Grenadiers were pretty elite. And fun fact, eventually it got to the point where the Grenadiers no longer had grenades. Like they had grenades in the beginning, but by the time 1787 rolled around, around. They were just given regular muskets like the other soldiers. But even at that time, they were still considered to be very elite warriors. They were one step below the royal guard, and a lot of times would be deployed, you know, some of the most dangerous missions. They would be used to experiment with new tactics and strategies, as the royal guard was as well. Musketeers were most of the infantry. And that chances are, if you served in the Prussian military at this time, you know, you would have been a musketeer. That was the biggest section. And then, and you correct me if I'm wrong, I'm not sure if this comes later, but there was the reserves as well that they had. I think the Landwehr.
I think I know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
That came in later on, in a way.
That might have been Frederick the Great.
Yeah, because if we're talking about along the lines of conscription, then yes, that would be something along the lines of Frederick the Great. But you're right, now that you corrected me on this issue, because this is a part of history, oddly enough, that I wasn't as detailed on, or rather knew enough information on, other than Frederick.
Yeah.
Now, you could say that after giving that kind of description, this sounds very familiar with what happened with Alexander the Great of Macedon, because his father, Philip II, was the one that turned the state into a military power, and Alexander was the one that benefited from it.
Exactly, because Wilhelm I was one who built the foundation. Because what happened, he created the reforms within the military that were necessary for Prussia to actually become a major military force, and structured the armed forces in such a way that they were able to compete with the other armed forces of Europe in terms of training, in terms of equipment quality, administration, all the things that go into the military. Where Frederick the Great came in was, you know, by the time Wilhelm I died, or Frederick Wilhelm. Frederick, you know, there's a Wilhelm and a Frederick Wilhelm. You know,
Lots of
you get the
Fredericks.
idea. You get the idea. But by the time he died, Prussia had a very formidable military establishment, and Frederick the Great was the one that actually used this to really flex their muscles. And Frederick the Great is often credited, like I'm sure even people who don't know about Prussia very much
They knew who
know
Frederick
Frederick the Great, because he was really the one who put Prussia on the map as a major power. Their military was good before Frederick the Great,
but it wasn't tested.
But it wasn't tested, so they were considered to be a second-rate power. It was Frederick the Great who actually shocked Europe with the military capabilities of Prussia and forced other nations to recognize Prussia as a major European power. And the way they did that was seizing Sicilia.
No, Silesia.
Silesia, I mispronounced that.
In
Silesia.
So now we're going to give a little bit of backstory as to how that even happened. So you know about the imperial sanction law, and this was taking place in the Austrian Habsburg Empire. And this was when Maria Theresa took power. And the problem with this scenario is that anyone that was the ruler in Austria was automatically the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. And according to the Holy Roman Empire rules, it was always going to be a man.
Yeah, they did not, back then, they did not take very kindly to the idea of a female being an absolute monarch.
They either thought they were too weak or that they were too terrifying. It was going to be one of those two scenarios. So the emperor, before he died, he gave Maria Theresa a law that stated that she could technically rule. However, the Holy Roman Emperor electors, specifically Frederick the Great, or in German, Frederick the Grosse, said, no, that's illegal. So in that case, I'm going to go take Silesia. Mind you, this is all a ruse to take that territory, because Silesia is one of the most important provinces of the Habsburg Empire. And why that is think of it like this. Silesia is a mountainous region with massive deposits in coal and iron. So, and lots of craftsmen lived in that area. So, if Prussia was able to grab it, it would already have a financial surplus, considering their resources, because, like I said before, they didn't have the best of situations at the starting point. So for them to grab Silesia would be the same thing as if we were to find a gold mine here in Texas, along with it being in oil. So
exactly, and even independent of resources, that one of the reasons for Prussian expansionism had a lot to do with how they started, because Prussia actually was fairly conservative in their foreign policy. compared to a lot of European powers. You know, they were very wary of overexpanding, and that a lot of times when they did overexpand, it came back to bite them in the butt.
Oh, yeah.
Just ask Napoleon, and you know, later on in World War I, the British and French.
Or even Frederick the Great during the 7 Years' War, when he had to fight, like, what, 7 nations pretty much?
Exactly. You know, and so what happened was, you know, they were not super keen on going to war offensively. However, they recognized that because geographically they were in a very disadvantageous position, like this book even talks about a Franco-Russian sandwich, which is one of our favorite descriptions in the book, that gaining more land was a matter of security for them because they had a buffer territory between them and other territories. And then, as you mentioned, there's that added bonus of, you know, more natural resources,
more ability to be sustainable,
more farmland, but also more population. So the thing about the Prussian military, one of the things that they struggled with for a very long time was numbers. That even though their military was excellent qualitatively, they had some of the best training in Europe. Their weapons technology was very advanced for the time. That one of the areas where they fell short of many of the other countries was population. Now, they did make up for this in some ways, such as by requiring military service. They did have a very high percentage of people who served in the military, so a lot of times the size of Prussia's army was comparable to its neighbors, but that was just the army they were maintaining. You know, in wartime, when you're talking about reservists and drafting people and having, you know, maybe peasant armies to fill in the gaps, like the countries around Prussia, notably France and Russia, Russia, not to be confused with Prussia, had that luxury of being able to field massive armies. The Prussians, you know, and I think this is one of the things that explains their emphasis on military technology and discipline. They had to be good qualitatively because they knew they were going to be outnumbered. It's kind of like how you know, really you could say that about a lot of Western countries, especially compared to Eastern countries, but Prussia in particular, that a lot, you know, that when you're dealing with a country that has a much smaller population than the enemies, technology and very good military organization, very good tactics are how you're able to make up for it. It's kind of like Israel, like when we're talking about Israel and Prussia, like Prussia and Israel are countries that we compare a lot. Same thing with Prussia and Sparta and Israel, because those are all examples of countries where, you know, you have a relatively small piece of territory without a huge population, and that military might is how you can make up for that. That, like in the Middle East, for example, Israel's surrounded by enemies, but they're able to be a tough nut to crack by having the most advanced military in the region, and some would argue the most advanced military in the world. I know there's some areas where the US and China and Russia are ahead of them, but there's other areas where the Israelis actually are a bit ahead. Like I know drone technology is one of them, and also the variation of the avionics that are in the F-35I, I think are more advanced than the other ones. But kind of getting back to Prussia, that they were forced in this position where they had to make sure their military was really on point. However, you know, even that has its limits, and that annexing territory was a way for them to give more parity between Prussia and some of their neighbors. Yeah,
Prussia was other than that sense that they have to expand in order to defend themselves. Basically, we're all familiar of the term fight or flight. Here's the thing, they had nowhere to fly to. They had nothing but to survive, and that's very much ingrained into their social dynamic ever since the 30 Years' War, because remember what we said about population? It wasn't just their agriculture that they had. During the 30 Years' War, their whole territory was a battleground for the 30 Years' War between the Catholic and Protestant forces, and what that created was almost apocalyptic to them. It would be as if saying, imagine the whole East Coast being severely devastated and large swaths of Texas had been depopulated. Like, just imagine Houston having no one left.
Yeah, exactly. In that, whoa, the microphone fell.
That's not good. But that's basically the scenario. Try to think of it like that.
Okay, hopefully this microphone did not fall earlier than I thought, because there might be some audio missing if that's the case. But we want to have some time to talk about other things, so let's get a little bit more through the history. So we have Frederick the Great, who turns Prussia into a massive military power that gains the respect of all of Europe. You know, and nowadays, in the 21st century, there's a lot of jokes about the French surrendering to the Germans because of World War II. But oddly enough, at this time, it was actually the French who ended up kicking Prussia's ass in a war Napoleon.
Ooh, Napoleon Bonaparte.
What happened with that? So the thing with Prussia, so I'll kind of explain some of the background, and maybe you can get some details. How it sound good? So the thing with Prussia was that at this point in time, they were resting on their laurels a lot. Like when the Napoleonic Wars rolled around, that a lot of their generals were old. Frederick the Great was, that he was in the past at this point.
Yeah, he had already passed away.
Already passed away. And they were just kind of, relying on their reputation to deter people. But there were other issues as well, because their soldiers were still very disciplined. Like, a lot of the problems existed at the top. So strategically, there was a lot of infighting between the different military officers and
a little bit in basically their version of the State Department. It was also having trouble.
But on the tactical level, they were still strong. That the soldiers, were well disciplined, well trained. The problem was that their military doctrine did not really evolve to catch up with the times, because they were very regimented, but they were almost like too regimented. And for a military, that might sound strange, but what happened was that they were so focused on discipline and order that it disincentivized creativity among the commanders on the ground, and they got stuck in these really rigid doctrines. And that's something that actually seems to be a common problem throughout German history. Like, you fast forward to World War I with the Schlieffen Plan. The Schlieffen Plan, for all the things that were good about it, the main problem was that if one thing went wrong, the entire plan could go down the toilet. And that is kind of what Prussia ran into against the French. And that what happened was Napoleon, after defeating the French and the Austrians, basically was in a position where he could give out pieces of Europe at will. So he gave Italy and I think it was the Netherlands to his brothers. And that he was negotiating with all these these other countries and divvying out land as he saw fit. And what happened was that he annexed a bunch of the German states and declared himself the guardian of I think it was it called the Confederation of the Rhine at that point, or was it something else? I remember reading Confederation of the Rhine.
Yeah, it's the Confederation of the Rhine.
But so what happened was that Frederick, let me make sure, so Frederick Wilhelm III, so it is the third at this point, just checking, this was intolerable for him, that he that he was afraid of this outcome. He didn't want Napoleon to keep expanding, and that they had actually considered joining the coalition against Napoleon, but the coalition of Austria and Russia got defeated before Prussia actually joined. So what happened is that Prussia issued an ultimatum to Napoleon, and maybe you can go into a little bit more detail about that. I'll let you explain the second half.
Well, I'm going to first off go off of what you said earlier and say that Prussia was one of those states at the time that their system was good, it was just too good. So they went with the idea that similar with the Titanic, it was too good to fail. And that's what happened with what you said with a lot of German history.
Well, do you know about the ultimatum? Because I can explain that.
Not in great detail.
Okay, but what happened eventually was, Napoleon, and I forget some of the details about the specifics, but what happened was that, not only was he expanding territorially, but, he was, with some of the treaties with the Prussians, he wanted a very high degree of control over Prussian internal affairs that they were just unwilling to accept.
Oh, okay, I remember that.
And that what happened was eventually, Frederick Wilhelm III got fed up with this. He's like, you know what, Napoleon, we're Prussia, you don't mess with us. And that you either need to get out, allow us to trade as we please. And
get out of the continental system.
Yeah, get out of the continental system, or else it's war. Napoleon was undeterred because he was Napoleon. So war it was. And quite surprisingly, and this blew a lot of people's mind at this point, Prussia lost.
And badly.
Really bad. As a matter of fact, Prussia was almost destroyed at this point in time.
Mind you, if you had to think of, we've always talked about how small Prussia was. By the time of the Napoleonic Wars, we already mentioned Silesia, and they already took over areas like Altmark, Magdeburg, and then parts of Royal Prussia, which was the territory that was run by the Poles, and they ruled as much territory in Poland as far east as Warsaw. So that's quite a bit of territory. And in terms of population, they were about equal to the British Home Islands, which was about almost 8 million. The Prussians were at almost 9 million. So they were finally at a population that was close enough. And what Preston means by being almost completely annihilated, they went from 9 million back to 2 or 3. They have lost almost everything. And part of the reason why the Prussians were not necessarily involved as much in terms of the coalitions until the ultimatum was that the Prussians followed a system where the only time they would get involved or get involved in wars was when they would know that they would absolutely win. And in terms of the ultimatum, that was the only, if not one of a few cases in all of Prussian history where it was uncertain.
Yeah, because they were reduced to a very small piece of land, and that they were more or less at the mercy of the Russians and the French.
Yep.
So, because the thing is, so the Russians were still in the game at this point. You know, Napoleon had, Napoleon failed to conquer Russia. You know, totally. Russia, they lost territory, they lost some power, but they stuck around. You know, that they never actually got conquered. So they maintained their status as a major power in Europe through the Napoleonic Wars, even though there were some times when Napoleon was kicking their ass. And eventually they came back to kick Napoleon's ass. So
right.
Revenge, sweet revenge, right? But what happened was that, at this time that France and Russia were really the two big dogs on the block, that those were the countries that really were able to decide what happened in Europe, particularly when it came to how land was distributed, and in which part of Europe really, it depended on which part of Europe in terms of who had more power. Obviously the French, the further west you went, the more, and that after they had conquered all that land, that they were able to unilaterally decide a lot of things that in the past maybe they would have needed Russia's approval for. But Frederick Wilhelm III literally had to stand outside in the rain while Napoleon, the Russian Tsar, were negotiating and wait to hear about the fate of his country, and that it was pretty bad. Like Prussia ended up being basically a vassal. They were occupied, by the French. They were only able to maintain a very small military. They had control over their justice system, but most functions of society were under the control of the French.
And they had to be a forward base of operations when Napoleon invaded Russia in 1812 with his Grand Army.
Exactly, and then, so this was bad for Russia too, because not only did it lose an ally, but it ended up becoming a staging area. But the thing was, though, with Prussia is that they did not leverage their advantage of having Russia as an ally as much as they could have.
Right.
Because what happened was that when they issued this ultimatum to Napoleon, decided they were going to war, Russia was not notified, and neither were the Austrians. Because Russia and Austria were the two countries that really were powerful enough where they could have stood up to Napoleon, and that they lost to Napoleon the first time around. But with the help of Prussia, it's possible that they could have gotten their revenge. But what happened was that the Prussians decided to just wing it, and they didn't let the Russians know, they didn't let the Austrians know. So there were no Austrian or Russian troops to support the Prussian military. The only people that they had was Saxony, and compared to the Grand Army, I mean, I don't know. That wasn't really that much extra help.
Go figure. Just a few, just like not even 100,000 versus 500,000. Good luck.
Oh yeah, exactly. But what's really interesting about the Napoleonic Wars, though, is there's a couple of implications this has for Prussian history. First of all, it's an example of how, for Prussia, because it was so small, almost every war was a life or death war. That it was like this was the one time from their beginning all the way up to probably the German Empire that they ever lost a military conflict, and it showed how bad it was for Prussia to lose, and that there were a lot of other times where they came close to the same outcome. They were only able to avoid it because they won the war.
Right? They just happened to be on the winning side.
Exactly.
So I guess this is about the time where we start talking about the Congress of Vienna?
Yeah, you can get into that a little bit, and then there's something I want to move on to afterwards.
Well, in case any of you are unaware, the Congress of Vienna was after the defeat of Napoleon, and it created this whole new world order, in a sense. And at this time, they said, okay, France is clearly a threat on the continent. We don't want another Napoleon taking over. So what we're going to do is that Russia, you take over what's left of Poland. Austria, you get the land that you originally had, including parts of Italy. And then, this is where it gets interesting. Prussia was given its land back, with the exception of Poland, and then was given the Rhineland. So what this created, in a sense, was that the great powers of the time, they didn't realize this. They ended up creating not only a new counterbalance against the French, they ended up creating a monster that was going to be even more powerful than the French later down the line.
So, and this was one of those time periods where it really showed just how opportunistic and just how lucky Prussia really was.
Truly.
Because ironically, their defeat at the hands of Napoleon, actually with the Congress of Vienna, set the stage for them becoming much more powerful later on. Because what happened was that when Prussia was beat by Napoleon, and we're going to take a step back a little bit, that wasn't quite the end of the story as far as the war was concerned. Because later on, you know, there were multiple Napoleonic wars. The reason why it's called the Napoleonic wars plural, is because there was a series of military conflicts.
It was a time period.
And what happened was that towards the end, you know, at the Battle of Waterloo, when Napoleon was defeated, the Prussian military played a decisive role in helping the coalition defeat Napoleon. So what happened was that the other European powers were grateful, you know, that they're like, you know, that these Prussian guys really were one of the main reasons why we were able to defeat Napoleon at the end. And so what happened was that they recognized how important of an ally that they could be, and that they wanted to, you know, make sure that Prussia was given what it was owed to avoid creating bad blood between the Prussians and themselves. Because they weren't being benevolent toward Prussia. Let's be real. This was Europe. They were realist, but they didn't want to get too much on Prussia's bad side, you know, and they saw that Prussia could be useful later on. So a combination of all those different things led them to want to reward Prussia for what they had done. And the thing that's interesting about Prussia is that not only did they get all their land back, but they got back land they didn't even ask for.
They almost let's see. I guess you could say they were given they got a third bigger than they were originally.
I forget the name of it, but that one piece of land. No, the Rhineland. The Rhineland. What happened was that the reason why the Prussians got the Rhineland was not because they were trying to get it, but because the British were very adamant that Prussia should get the Rhineland. And Prussia, I mean, you're not going to complain about getting extra territory. So what happened? The British just absolutely insisted that Prussia got the Rhineland. And then seeing, you know, the opportunity to gain more land, the Prussians were like, sure, this is a good deal.
Okay, great. You want us to fight the French? Okay.
So they ended up getting the Rhineland. So what that did was it gave them a lot more territory, and this is when Prussia really, really, really became a major power, because the next step was the path to unification of the German Empire. So the reason why we don't talk about Prussia as much when we're talking about the history of the 1800s and 1700s is because in the late 1800s, Prussia was just part of Germany, and Prussian military power was what unified Germany. So what happened was, you know, they continued to exist throughout, you know, the 1830s, 1840s, continuing to be a formidable military power. But what was interesting was, you know, there were some inklings of this idea of a larger German identity at a certain point.
This began in 1848. That was the period where many of the revolutions were taking place. So this is where the idea of a national state started, because Germany was one of the places it began. It also happened in Austria and Italy. But in the case of Italy, and for our discussion, Germany, this is where you get this pan-German sense that they needed to create a nation. However, the reason why they never went further with this was that one, Prussia was a stable nation, but that the question came up of which German nation would take power over the rest. Would it be Prussia or would it be Austria?
Yeah, exactly. So what ended up happening was that, you know, the Prussians, they wanted, they eventually decided, and this really took off with Otto von Bismarck.
I've been waiting for that name.
That they wanted, they didn't want to just rule Prussia. They wanted to rule all of Germany. But what's interesting with Bismarck was initially he wasn't super in favor of German unification because he was very patriotic for the Prussians. You know, that he loved Prussia. You know, he loved the Prussian monarchy. And he didn't want that to be compromised. But what eventually happened is because of the revolutions, because of some of the pan-Germanism that arose during this time period, Otto von Bismarck eventually changed his mind.
Because there was an opportunity
and he was a conservative. He actually ended up using the liberals' own argument against them in some ways because the liberals were the ones who initially came up with this idea. And then he was the one who said in his famous speech that the future, you know, will be decided, the future of Prussia will be decided, and I'm not quoting word for word, this is paraphrasing, but will be decided by, not by his liberalism, but by his power. And that the mistake of 1848 was trying to make decisions through negotiations and speeches, and that the decisions now, the great questions of the day, will be answered with iron and blood.
I thought it was blood and iron.
No, it was iron and blood.
Oh,
blood
okay.
and iron is kind of a misnomer. People switched it. But if you read the speech verbatim, it's iron and blood.
Still,
and
that's still amazing.
It's a badass. I mean, let me see if I can find the quote. I want to read this word for word, like I described it, but I want to read the quote.
Right. So it's really, this is where, that's why a lot of the time, whenever you hear about Prussia during the 19th century, it's always from the 1860s to the turn of the century. It's never really anything before that, other than simply trying to revive this, make a whole new system. Because remember, during the Napoleonic age, the old system of Frederick the Great had basically rusted out.
I'm going to read it. Germany is not looking to Prussia's liberalism, but to its power. Bavaria, Württemberg, Baden may indulge liberalism, and for that reason, no one will assign them Prussia's role. Prussia has to coalesce and concentrate its power for the opportune moment, which has already been missed several times. Prussia's borders, according to the Vienna treaties of 1814 and 15, are not favorable for a healthy, vital state. It is not by speeches and majority resolutions that the great questions of the time are to be decided. That was the big mistake of 1848 and 1849, but by iron and blood. Otto von Bismarck. So what happened was that he, you know, obviously they were expanding, but Austria did stand in the way because this idea of pan-Germanism was not unique to Prussia and the other German states. Austria, as a German-speaking country, wanted in on the game as well.
Can you imagine getting all those people together? Because mind you, before this, Germany as a state was never a thing until 1848. Before this, it was just a geographical area and served as a buffer zone between the Austrians and the Russians from the French.
Yeah, exactly. But, you know, what happened is that the Prussians ended up being victorious. There was a lot of reasons for this. By this time, Austria was not as strong as it had once been, but also Prussian military technology was way far ahead. Like the Dreise needle rifle was actually something that was a decisive instrument in the battle against the Austrians, because the Prussians, so their infantry had always been really, really, really good. Their cavalry too, but I know there were a lot of times where their cavalry was a bit smaller compared to other
and it was
European
losing.
countries.
It was the importance of it was dying out.
Yeah, but they still, you know, once again, Prussia really concentrated on having a good military pound for pound, and that they were able to reload like 3 times as fast as the Austrian troops, because the Austrians were still using the traditional muskets, where you put the powder in, and you put the projectile, and whereas the Prussians, what they had was the Dreise needle rifle. It was the first bolt-action rifle ever used in combat. So kind of almost like what the United States did with the Garand. It was the first semi-automatic. That was like the Garand of its day. It was the first bolt-action as opposed to the first semi-automatic. It had paper cartridges where it was self-contained with the powder, the primer, and the projectile. And that they didn't have firing pins yet back then, but there was a needle. It was almost like a primitive firing pin. And that it would strike the primer, and it explode and launch that projectile, and they were real accurate too, from what I've read. And yeah, they were able to wipe the floor with Austria, and then they wiped the floor with the French later on as well, because the French, that they So what happened was that the French and the British didn't want to unify Germany as under their rule necessarily, but they were concerned about what a unified Germany would mean.
Right.
That even though they didn't necessarily see that territory as being something that should belong to them, they recognized that if Germany was unified, it would be a lot stronger, and it could challenge their hegemony in Europe.
Yeah, because in terms of the French, that just meant, oh great, we have a nation that's about the same size and could have more population against the French. And then for the British, oddly enough, they had a stake in this as well, because the king of Great Britain of the time, he was also considered a head, how do I put this? The head honcho over a German state known as Hanover, which was a neighbor to the west of Prussia. So that would mean their lands could be taken if Prussia were to become aggressive.
Exactly. But what's interesting is how Bismarck was able to use France, ironically, to fulfill his goals, right?
Yep.
Like in some ways, the French actually contributed to what the Prussians wanted and what the French had hoped to avoid, which was a unified Germany. Because there was a letter actually that, not a letter, a transcript that Bismarck had manipulated it was a meeting between the Prussian king and, was it the French king or someone else?
I believe it was the French. It was Napoleon III.
Yeah, Napoleon III, and he manipulated it to make it sound like they were mad at each other and that they were real nasty towards each other.
Especially Napoleon III being
And then he published it in the paper. So what this did is he was able to provoke a conflict with the French and then make it conditional for the other German states. He gave them an ultimatum that we'll protect you from the French only if you join us. And that's exactly what they did. And then once they beat the French in the war, their future was secured. And by the time 1871 rolled around, Germany was unified, and it was no longer Prussia; it was the German Empire. Ooh. So this provides us an important question, because after this I want to get to World War I, World War II, and then sort of analyzing what made Prussia great from a policy and strategy perspective.
Yep.
And this is a question I want to ask you, and then I'm going to answer it too. So when Germany unified, did Prussia become Germanized, or did Germany become Prussianized? Because this is something that historians debate about a lot.
And actually, that's what Otto von Bismarck was worried about, in a sense.
Well, that's one of the reasons why he did not embrace the idea of German unification earlier, because he did not want Prussia to become Germanized. He wanted Prussia to stay Prussia. Like I said, he was very patriotic. He loved Prussia, and he loved the Prussian monarchy. He didn't want any of those things to be compromised.
I would say the issues that Otto von Bismarck had, the reasons why he was against the idea of turning Prussia into the German Empire, it kind of became true. The way I would see it was that Prussia was Prussia, but once it took over the German states, it had to dilute itself a little bit and be a Germany. So, because it started off with Prussia, took over the rest of the German states, so it was still technically Prussia, but it had German aspects to it. Or rather, in order to better facilitate the rest of the German populace, which were either monarchies, councils, or city-states, rather, depending on how you argue it, they had to be able to somehow make it tolerable for all the other states to become servient to the Prussian monarchy. So in that sense, they kind of had to be a little, quote unquote, nicer to them. In other words, and also to get the German population to be more in line and listen to the Prussian monarchy and their rules, they kind of had to dilute themselves a little bit. But here's the kicker. If you dilute it a little bit, not only are you able to placate the population, you can eventually bring more Prussianism back into the realm once they're more accustomed to it. It's a general crouching effect.
So basically, the way they were able to solve this problem was that they asserted Prussian control over the
German
military,
states.
The military.
Oh,
and
yes.
And then also that they made sure that the Prussian monarch became the emperor. So what happened was that they were able to, when it came to local matters, that they were able to placate the other German states because they maintained a high degree of autonomies. For example,
that was one of the reasons.
For example, a lot of even after the German Empire was created, a lot of the German states still had their own kings. Bavaria's Ludwig II was a good example of this.
Oh yeah, the Grand Prince.
Yeah, so a lot of them still had their own kings and dukes and princes, and that in a lot of ways still had their own rule. But what happens is that these nobles were vassals to the emperor. So what happened was that they were able to concentrate military power and the majority of the political power at the federal level with the Prussians, while in return allowing the rest of the country to have some autonomy with their own local affairs. So, for me personally, like I definitely think that Germany was more Prussianized because Prussia was really able to avoid having to lose any of their culture to these other states.
Yeah.
The fact that the Prussian monarch ended up as the emperor, and the fact that they still got to be their own state within Germany, and that they controlled the military, those were all things that worked to their advantage, and that they were able to maintain that distinct Prussianness that they were afraid of losing, and in fact were able to spread that to the rest of Germany, and that is why Germany was able to be so militaristic, because not every German state was like that, but Prussian culture permeated throughout the rest of the German states, and eventually became the glue that held together what we now know as the German Empire that existed up until about 1918, with the end of World War I, which Germany lost.
I guess you could say, if we had to shorten our views on it, in Preston's case, it was a Germany that was Prussianizing, while I'm saying that it's Prussian government that had to have German aspects added. So I guess you could say it's very similar.
Yeah, very similar. Maybe we would disagree about the extent to which German characteristics were added to the way that the Prussian royal house actually operated. But in terms of what the situation looked like for most of the German states, as well as what the situation looked like for the military, we're in pretty broad agreement.
Yeah, and plus we both know it would end in the same scenario.
So with that being said, so Prussia sort of as an independent entity in geopolitics ended with that. They became the German Empire, even though they were still in charge of it, that they had all this new territory, they were acting a bit different. So World War I and World War II we're going to go over briefly. So World War I was one of those times where, I think Prussia, Germany made kind of the same blunder there that they made in the Napoleonic Wars in terms of the over-expansion and that willingness to fight, or that not willingness to fight, that desire to fight just for the sake of fighting. Like in this book, one of the things it talked about was how one of the mistakes in military doctrine that led to the Prussian defeat at the hands of Napoleon was this idea that they had to fight the French in all places at all times at every opportunity, because Napoleon actually at that time didn't have as much interest in expanding into Prussia as some people might think, but with the ultimatum and everything, they escalated it and then they lost. With World War I, the Germans had the most powerful military in the world. Like
it was pretty much no question.
The only country that could match them or maybe beat them was probably Britain on the high seas. The British still had a very good navy at this point, and that the German navy was better qualitatively, but the British navy was better quantitatively. So the Prussians had a more modern navy with more advanced ships. They had more dreadnoughts and stuff like that. But the British, they still had modern ships. And even though they didn't have as many modern ships, they had more ships. So there were more of the older stuff that was also in service to supplement the more modern pieces of technology. And so they really, with the possible exception of Britain, could have beat any country one-on-one. But they got so ambitious that they ended up fighting a whole bunch of different countries. And by this time, the Austrians and the Ottomans were teetering on the brink of collapse. Like the Ottoman Empire was called the sick man of Europe. The Austrians were not doing much better at this point.
Yeah, they were slowly dying because of the multiple ethnicities that existed. And that's part of the reason why Austria was not accepted into this whole German unification. That's part of the reason, because Austria had been too focused towards the east that to the Germans, they kind of saw Austrians as the Germans that lost their way, in a sense. So they decided not to add them to the group or add them to this party, so to speak.
And what happened too was, so after World War I ended, Prussianism didn't go away, and it was actually one of the reasons why Nazi Germany came back, because Hitler was able to exploit the Prussian myth. because at this time it had attained legendary status. You know,
Oh, yeah.
that Prussia as a country separate from Germany, like we talked about, no longer existed. It was part of the German Empire, you know, or it ruled over the German Empire. And then when the German Empire ended, you know, it became part of the Weimar Republic. But the great military deeds of Frederick the Great and of Bismarck,
And then,
you know, lived in the memories of the German people, and that Hitler was able to capitalize on that politically. And that's one of the reasons why, sad face, Prussia ended.
Sad German noises.
Sad German noises. Because eventually, when the Germans were beat in World War II, you know, the Allies recognized that, you know, this was, you know, after going through this World War, you know, so much destruction. Hitler, you know, the Holocaust. Like, I think total like 70 to 100 million people died in World War II, like around the world. You know, and like, this can't happen again. Germany's dangerous. You know, they were rightfully concerned about this potential possibility that Germany could try a third time, and that they recognized that if not politically and militarily, then at least culturally, Prussia was a big part of why Germany did what it did.
Right. It's interesting when you started talking about the idea of Prussian invincibility. And part of another argument that Adolf Hitler did was he said something along the lines of, well, we were so good that in World War I, we didn't actually lose. We went into an armistice. The rest of the European powers were falling apart. And they said, we decided to make peace, and the only reason why we decided to do peace was because we were starving.
Yeah,
that was it.
Well, also too, like the Germans ran out of troops.
Not only that, and the king, the Kaiser, Wilhelm II, was just such a poor leader.
Yeah, it is funny how easily World War I could have been avoided, and how Bismarck actually had the foresight to recognize that Germany would be in that sort of situation. Because what's interesting, particularly about Bismarck, but I think the same thing can be said about Prussia in general, is that they didn't just use the military all the time. You know, like Prussia a lot of times is cited as an example of how military power overcomes everything, and how economic or political power maybe doesn't matter as much if you have the guns. But the reality was that diplomacy was a big part of how Germany and Prussia were able to become and remain powerful. Because Bismarck, he was very wary of biting off more than he could chew.
Oh yeah, that's why he wasn't in favor of colonies.
Yeah, because he didn't want to. He didn't want to overexpand. Like a lot of countries overexpand. You had the Romans, you had the Soviet Union. Nowadays you have the United States, which is overexpanding. You know, and subsequently we're declining as well. So a lot of countries throughout history. And those are only 3 examples. There's tons of other ones.
There are many.
A lot of countries throughout history, including countries that existed well before Prussia became a thing, had overexpanded, and that Bismarck was afraid of Germany doing the same thing. So he actually took a very diplomatic approach to international relations once he successfully unified Germany. And Bismarck was one of the forces keeping Europe at peace during the 1880s and the 1890s, and then eventually got dismissed. And then what happened, Wilhelm II, the problem with him was he embraced the exact opposite. But what was interesting is that Otto von Bismarck had said of the German Empire something to the effect of when this all comes undone, it's going to be because of some foolish thing in the Balkans. Like he actually,
in like 20 years.
Yeah, in like 20 years, and that. And there was some other quote, I forget, but he had referenced something similar. But basically, Bismarck predicted World War I.
He did.
And that had Bismarck stayed in power a little bit longer, it could have been avoided, or if the next ruler had a similar ideology. But what happened, Wilhelm I and Frederick III were the monarchs that Bismarck had served. And then Wilhelm II came along. Wilhelm II was much more of an offensive realist. You know, Bismarck was more of a defensive realist. He cared a lot about power and national interest, but he placed more of an emphasis on pursuing the proper amount of power than the maximum amount of power. Whereas Wilhelm II wanted to pursue the maximum amount of power. And that's what happened. And so they ended up biting off more than they could chew. They lost all of their soldiers at war, but what happened was the Allies made a mistake, similar to how the British and the Russians and everyone, we're not thinking about what Germany could become, or Prussia then would become if you gave them all this territory. The Allies were not thinking about what Germany could become again if you gave them terms that, didn't make it obvious to them that they had been defeated, because the terms were very harsh on Germany, which is one of the reasons why they didn't like the outcome, of the Treaty of Versailles, but what happened was that they didn't make it clear that Germany had been defeated. One of my history professors told me what they would have needed to do to prevent another rise of Germany was march into Berlin and occupy it, but they did not do that. And that what happened was that Hitler was able to exploit these conspiracy theories that the Jews and a bunch of other groups that in reality had absolutely nothing to do with this had made Germany surrender because they hated Germany, because he was able to, the perception of a lot of people at this time was that Germany was winning the war, and then all of a sudden there was this armistice. And that's not what happened. They ran out of truce, but Hitler was able to exploit this myth. Like I said, he was able to blame the Jews, he was able to blame the gypsies, homosexuals, all sorts of different groups that had absolutely nothing to do with the situation.
Pretty much anyone that did not fit his idea of the German.
Exactly. Yeah, and in a lot of ways, we can blame Hitler for the end of Prussia, because he was the one, not only the expansion of Germany, but the fact that he used Prussianness. Like, there's something here in this book where it talks about that by the end of World War II, the British regarded Prussia as a country that was so morally rotten to its core that the only solution was to dissolve it. And that happened in 1947, the end of Prussia. But the reason why we talk about history as opposed to just contemporary politics is because it can inform us today, and that this history of Prussia, while it may have ended in 1947, was very interesting, and there's a lot to unpack here. So I think we can learn from some of the successes and failures. So when we look at it from a strategic perspective, so getting out of the historical chronology and getting more into the ideas and why
the pieces.
Happened, what was it that actually made Prussia great? So militarily, economically, politically, socially. In your opinion, how would you define that? What was it that made Prussia great? Because as we talked about in the beginning, this wasn't really the country you would think of as being the most likely.
Right. Honestly, the way I would put it is similar to what Otto von Bismarck was like, and a lot of what Prussian military diplomacy and social thinking was. All options are on the table. And what I mean by that is that, oddly enough, if you read the history of Prussia, especially in the Rise of Prussia that Preston was showing earlier, is that they were, oddly enough, a hybrid in a weird way. Because yes, they were a monarchy, and as an autocratic state, naturally it was going to be harsh towards its citizenry. But what made it special was that it was also nice to its citizenry and harsh towards its autocracy. So this is all of a, I guess you could call it a web between the military, economic, social, and social including the religion.
So
and then what was the fourth one?
Well, they're all right here.
Political. I didn't mention the political.
But I was going to say, I think some of the social and political and military actually blend together a little bit. So
that's
actually,
why I said
what I want to focus on next is the aristocracy, the nobility, and particularly their relationship with peasants. So can you explain that a little bit?
Okay, sure. Now, this was more common during Frederick the Great's reign, and a little bit before that with his predecessor, Frederick Wilhelm. And what happened in that time period was the state followed the famous three estates: the nobility, the clergy, and the peasantry. And the king had to somehow navigate through these three different opponents within the nation, not only from outside. So what did Frederick the Great most famously do? He did something along the lines of the nobility you're not going to have control over the serfs, the peasantry. The peasantry are going to be free. They can do whatever they want. The land that they own, they can buy and sell it, but they can't sell it to the nobility. And the nobility, you can do whatever you want with the land that you have, except you don't have control of the serfs, and you can only buy and sell between each other. You cannot leave the nation or get married unless you have approval of the king. And one of the ways that you can gain the approval of the king was this: all noble sons are going to work in the officer corps. That way they gain discipline, that they will follow the rules, and that when they need to make actions, they will make actions with the most nonpartisan views and be able to do what's best for the nation, for society, for the monarch, for God, and as a whole.
Yeah.
So am I missing here in terms of the military? Oh, I mentioned the peasantry, so this is probably a good time for you to get in on the social aspect.
Yeah, so what I was going to talk about, because the original question I asked you is kind of in, I guess, broad and concise terms, what you believe fundamentally it was that made Prussia great. For me,
oh, my bad.
No, it's fine. That was a big part of it. That was a big part of it, because I think you honed in on something that's really important. So for me, the way I would answer this is it came down to 5 things. I have them written down here. Opportunism, their ability to dictate the terms of engagement, the fact that they had flexible means of exerting power, their organizational and political centralization, as well as their diplomacy. So organizational and political centralization, I think that's what you were alluding to, so I'm going to go with that. So what happened is, as in most societies, you had a couple of different conflicts internally that really made it difficult and that Prussia had to overcome in order to be a great power. And being a European power during the 1700s and 1800s, this had to do with peasant and noble relations, as well as the relationship between the noble's own goals and the goals of the state. And what they were able to do very effectively was centralize the control of the state over foreign policy and military affairs. So with the nobility, what this meant was that the kings and the emperors maintained a high degree of control over what they were able to do, and were able to create an arrangement where the nobility had to support the Prussian state in order to benefit themselves. So you mentioned, I think, you talked about like the marriage thing, right? Yeah, so they had to get the approval of the Prussian king to get married. They had to serve in the military academy to be able to travel and study abroad. And that a lot of the privileges that the nobility had were made dependent on their service to the Prussian monarchy and to the Prussian state. That they were required, both nobility and peasants were required to serve in the military.
Well, yes, but in terms of the officer corps, it was very much
the nobility was the officers, and the peasants a lot of times would be the soldiers. So what this did is it made it so that the nobility was no longer a source of resistance. And I think there's kind of some parallels between Prussia, the problems they were dealing with, and what America is dealing with right now. Because one of the reasons why we're having a hard time countering China and Russia and certain foreign enemies is because a lot of companies, due to the global nature of the economy, our billionaires are beholden to foreign interests, and that they can spend to influence political campaigns. And we're still figuring out how to deal with that here in the United States. But Prussia, they figured it out, given very different systems. So I'm not advocating we copy their solutions. Right. We're a constitutional republic, not a monarchy, but at the same time, they encountered a similar problem and had a pretty good solution to it. And then, so what this led to was a high degree of political centralization, and the same thing happened with the peasants and the nobility, because initially, the peasants basically, they were serfs, they were attached to land. They resented their status as serfs. So they were not working as efficiently as they could have been. Naturally. Which meant that the estates were not as profitable as they could be. What happened was that when they changed the system up, the peasants started getting paid, so they were happier. But what also happened was that their financial success became directly related to the success of the estate of the lord, and therefore they worked harder, and the nobility got richer than ever. Even though theoretically, like on paper, it looked like they lost some power. In reality, they got richer than ever. So both social classes were getting richer as a result of abolishing the serfdom. And what this led to was a massive growth in their economy.
In essence, their power moved to a different field.
Yeah, exactly. But there's a couple of other things too that I want to talk about. So the next thing is, so for number 2, flexible means of exercising power. So what they were able to do is they were able to combine military, diplomatic, and political and economic power in a way that was very seamless. So they were able to integrate
like I said, all options were on the table.
Exactly. Like I think Bismarck was a perfect example of this, how the fact that he was able to use a combination of diplomacy and war to achieve his objectives, that Prussia was not a one-trick pony. They understood the limitations of military conflict. And were able to adjust accordingly. That being said, they still recognize that their military was their biggest advantage, and that leads to the number 3 reason why I think they were, and these are in no particular order, but the third reason is that they were able to fight on their own terms. That Prussia was a small country that up until the German Empire was behind a lot of its rivals economically, but what they had was a good military. So they recognized that, and they went to war often, not because they liked war necessarily. As we talked about, they were often wary of war.
But the opportunity was good.
The opportunity was good, and that they recognized that the military is a distinct advantage that they could use to compensate for their disadvantage in other areas. And I've got 2 more things, and these are quick. The next thing, opportunism. That Prussia was very good at observing circumstances and being able to act based on that. Because,
they would jump in when they had absolute certainty that it was going to go in their favor.
Yeah, and the Prussians were always good at reading the circumstances. And because of that, they were able to time military offensives and diplomatic pushes almost perfectly in a lot of cases. And then the last thing really, and I already alluded to this before, was diplomacy, notably with the Russians.
Oh yeah, the Russians was the most important case.
So going back to this idea of a Franco-Russian sandwich, that the Prussians obviously were not in a good position as a result of this because they were the meat in the sandwich, but they were hungry and they decided they were going to enjoy this lunch nonetheless. And they figured out a way to work with it, and that especially in the early part of their civilization, particularly in the 1700s, they had some strong alliances with Russia, and that what they were able to do was, because they were friendly towards the Russians and the Russians reciprocated, that was an entire potential front of war that they no longer needed to worry about. So they were able to concentrate more forces towards the French, and that throughout German history, 2 front wars have just been the bane of their existence, and that the alliance with Russia and that their ability to use diplomatic tools to eliminate fronts of warfare was one of the things that allowed them to be great. So between these 5 things, that they were able to situate themselves, with the exception of the Napoleonic Wars in World War II, and World War I actually too as well, with the exception of those 3 time periods, were able to situate themselves more or less perfectly to take advantage of the situation at that time and to use that to achieve things that much more well-established European powers were unable to do.
For sure, and I do agree with a lot of those statements, partially because I had mentioned these a little bit previously, but not in consecutive order.
Yeah, that's why I started, because I had this one at the top, but that's why I started with this, because I think you did a good job with the organizational and political centralization. Like what you're talking about with the nobility is basically the short answer as to why that happened.
Yeah, that was one of the more obvious answers, that it had done that. So a lot of what both of us have said is very much the reason why Prussia was pretty much the idea of what a powerful nation along defensive realist lines could become.
So, if I remember the time we started correctly, we're going on an hour, so I think it's time we wrap this up with one last thing. So, history is very interesting, but I think from a practical perspective, the main reason why we study history is not because of history itself, but rather because it's useful for solving problems now. There's a lot of lessons that can be learned from history. There's a lot of times where a problem that we're facing now is similar to something that a country has faced at some other point in the past. So the last question I want to ask you And I want you to take the floor on this first. I've thought about this a little bit, just in a general sense, because I think we've already talked about the specifics when it comes to exactly how Prussia became what it was. What can we learn from Prussia? So, we're in the United States right now, we're Americans, although I'm sure some of this would apply to other countries as well. So, thinking about this from an American foreign policy perspective, or if you're viewing from another country, maybe you can think with us from the perspective of your foreign policy, maybe if we're in Russia or France or China. What are some of the successes and failures that Prussia had that we can look to as examples of what to do, what not to do in foreign relations? How can we learn from Prussia? How can we look at what Prussia did and use that as a blueprint to inform our own policy and to avoid making the mistakes that they did?
Are you sure that's one question? That's a little bit more like 3 questions, but I'll answer them the best way I can do it.
So I'm talking about it from a perspective of grand strategy. So that would be multiple questions if we were talking about tactics or strategy, but I'm really focusing on the big picture here.
Okay.
So from a perspective of grand strategy, what is there to learn?
What is there to learn from here is that 1, definitely bide your time for the perfect opportunity to strike. And when you do strike as hard as you possibly can and double it. That is pretty much the basic rundown for it. And if I had to add anything else, I would include basically doing something that is least likely to make sure that when you get into a conflict, it's not something that's going to put you in a 2-front war. And if you end up getting into a conflict, don't seek more all at once. Again, bide your time when you do that. If I had to add anything else, I would also say tolerance towards other societies is a very good method, at least keeping your nation stable, and that the society will be more likely to support the king, or not the king in this case, but rulers in general. And this is one of the
form of government you have.
Yeah, in terms of a government. And then actually this is what it comes from, The Prince by Niccolo Machiavelli. I very much recommend reading this because it very much teaches what a ruler in society ought to be like in order for it to be, successful or at least stable and alive.
Yeah.
So I already mentioned the social. I know I mentioned more. There's no substitute for victory. That's a pretty good one as well.
But that was MacArthur who said that.
It is, but it's but it's very much true in all realms.
And I think that is kind of, even if they didn't say it, that is kind of the doctrine that the Prussians seemed to go by.
They did. I believe that's about it, other than what I said before, that all options are on the table. So always consider the possibility and always be willing to, how do I put this? Definitely be flexible. Take whatever options you consider, take them that are the most suited, even if it might hurt you at the immediate, because it could very much help you in the long term.
Yeah, I think in a lot of ways, and I had said this the other day when Nicholas and I were actually talking about Prussia, preparing for this podcast, but in a lot of ways, Prussia was almost the China of Europe.
Oddly enough.
And the reason why I say that is because, so you look at China now, and Chinese politics and history is one of my areas of specialty, within political science.
And to me, as of
he's
recently.
actually been to China. Yeah, he's actually been to China. I've read a lot of books on China. I've written a lot of articles on China. But what China has been able to do is to build up their power while appearing benevolent. They focus very heavily on economic strength, and that lately when they have been militarizing, they've done so at a rapid pace that took the rest of the world by surprise. And that even when you talk about the tolerance, now it's weird because China's very intolerant of their own people's difference from Chinese government ideology, and they're also very intolerant of other political systems ideologically. However, they are willing to negotiate with and invest in pretty much anybody, whether they're a democracy or an autocratic regime, because if they're an autocratic regime, China sees that as an opportunity to strengthen an ally, and if they're a democratic society, they see that as an opportunity to colonize that society by having Chinese state-owned companies buy up everything. And that Prussia, they didn't follow that exact model, that they were mercantilist, but not to the extent that China was. However, that thing about biding their time and waiting for the right opportunity and using diplomacy to appear benevolent while plotting your next military moves is definitely what Prussia was able to do. But before you continue, there's really three main things that I want to point out here. And you already talked about two of them, so I'm not going to get too much in detail with two. But I think the main lessons from Prussia, from a grand strategic perspective, are the importance of strategic patience, adaptability, and then also internal strength in foreign policy. So with the strategic patience, you know, like you talked about, that you have to be willing to wait for the right time. And I think by all three of these standards, the United States has major problems.
Yeah, we failed in that in the last 50, 60 years.
Yeah, because so with strategic patience, like what we have a tendency to do in the United States is that we want things now. You know, we don't think about the long-term consequences of our military actions. We'll incur huge amounts of debt fighting wars in the Middle East. You know, we will protect countries that we really don't have a major strategic necessity to protect.
Or rather, we did see it, but that was in the past.
Exactly, like some of these agreements have outlived their utility. But what happens is like we just want to look strong, right? Like we're afraid of retreating from anywhere because we don't want the rest of the world to think that we're strong, that we're not strong. And we want to appear powerful at every turn at all times, and we just want to win, even if it's a Pyrrhic victory. With strategic patience, I think Prussia, one of the keys to their success was their ability to lose the battle to win the war. To say that, you know what, we're not going to commit the resources to this priority because we recognize that the outcome is not going to be worth it. And we would rather wait, build ourselves up militarily and economically, and then go for this in the long term.
Yeah, they didn't decide to take Pyrrhus's option where you fought the battle with all the resources possible just to win that battle.
Yeah, like that's one of the reasons why after they unified Germany, Bismarck was so conservative with his foreign policy and he didn't try to expand anymore, because he recognized that keeping Germany together and establishing Germany as a world power with its existing borders was going to be hard as it was.
Yeah, you'll eventually be seen as a threat.
So he didn't want to get into, they definitely were already seen as a threat at that point.
I mean, what I mean by that is not a nuisance or a threat that they have to watch their eye on. When Germany united, it got to the point of they are such a threat, we need to beat them down now.
Exactly, so he didn't want to get Germany to a quagmire. The second thing is adaptability. So Prussia, and this is one of those areas where you can learn from both their successes and their failures.
Very much.
Because it seemed like every time Prussia lost a war, is because they had a doctrine that was too rigid and inflexible.
Yeah, they became tunnel visioned.
And that every time Prussia won a war, which was most of the wars that they fought, it was because they were able to adapt to the enemy's tactics. So they were always able to stay one step ahead. And I think this kind of actually gives way to like a bit of a secondary thing that I think I had mentioned a little bit about being able to fight on your terms rather than the enemy's terms. That Miyamoto Musashi, in the Book of Fire and Rings, talks about the importance of when you're fighting, you want to lead the enemy rather than letting the enemy lead you. And you don't want to just be responding to what the enemy does. You want to actively be moving and striking and force them to respond to you. Prussia was very good with this. And I think America, in a lot of cases, we have the same issue. We're not very proactive. We don't really consider the long-term consequences. Like think about China and Russia, right? That our antagonism of Russia and our appeasement of China are the reasons why we've gotten to where we are with Russia trying to, with Russia expanding again in Europe and China challenging us for global hegemony, because we didn't think about, when you're trading with a country, using China as an example, when you're trading with a country on terms that are disproportionately to their benefit, you have to be prepared for the possibility that they might become strong and start challenging you, especially when they have 1.5 billion people, which means they could have the same GDP with less GDP per capita.
Oh, I almost forgot. There was a section that I completely forgot that is of importance, that what made Prussia great, what made China especially powerful as of recently, and the Russians to a lesser extent, and that we have failed in, was the proper use of our resources. Remember what I said about biding your time for the right opportunity to strike and not aim for a Pyrrhic victory, but win a war with little loss as possible?
Yeah.
There was one writer specifically, you had mentioned Minamoto Musashi, we all know about Sun Tzu and the Art of War.
Yeah, also
but
Clausewitz.
Another one, which I quite like, is Clausewitz.
Yeah.
And he's from Prussia. He's a Prussian around the time of Frederick the Great. And his policies, the way I call it, is basically being the accountant in charge of war. being basically the State Department or the Department of Defense here in the U.S. that's being run by accountants. You use the resources that you have, and when you use them with all your might, but the best way that you can with little loss.
So the last thing I would say that we can learn from Prussia, and this is going to close it out, is the importance of being internally strong before you project power abroad. And I think out of all of these areas, this is where the United States has been the worst.
Go tall, not wide.
Yeah, because with the United States, so what we've done is that with the exception of entitlements, like I know we spend a ridiculous amount on Social Security and Medicare, but besides that, we've spent so much money on the military and we've neglected things like education, our space program, even research and development for weapons,
right? Or
to fund foreign wars. And what that's done is it's left us with crumbling infrastructure, it's left us with a subpar education system, it's left us
infrastructure falling apart.
I already said that.
Oh yeah.
But it's left us in a situation where China and Russia are catching up to or even surpassing us in certain areas of military technology, and that we've sacrificed a lot of our own internal strength to try to be strong abroad, to contain Russia, to contain China, that sort of thing. Especially with the Middle East. Like I would say with China, I think containment of them is necessary. Like that's a cost I'm willing to shoulder. But with Russia and the Middle East, we've definitely sacrificed a lot in the way of opportunity cost.
More than we should.
Whereas Prussia, they understood that militaries are expensive, that and this was not as much of an issue back then. However, it's still important that to develop new weapon systems, you need an educated
research
population.
And development.
And once again, that wasn't as big of a deal back then because weapons were less complicated, but like it still had some role. That having an educated population, helped not only that, but also the economy. That infrastructure helped the military mobilize. And that when you look at the reforms of Frederick the Great, for example, that the reason why a lot of them are focused on domestic policy, the organization of the military, the organization of the bureaucracy, so on and so forth, is he recognized that in order for Prussia to be strong, they had to have the resources, the organization, and the domestic stability to be able to endure the pressure that foreign involvement inevitably places on a country.
That is true. I do agree with that.
So in a lot of ways, I think the way that we can learn something from Prussia is by observing, their emphasis on internal strength, and that America in a lot of ways has it backwards. I think we should be
right, or rather, we gone away from it.
Yeah. Well, yeah, because we used to focus more on ourselves, but now, I think instead of things like foreign aid and development economics and overseas military adventures, we should be orienting our trade policy and our fiscal policy more towards the goals of developing the best education that we can have.
Yeah, build ourselves up.
Developing our infrastructure, maximizing our exports, researching and developing the next generation of military technology. Because those are all the things that are prerequisites to that foreign involvement that can gain a country access to resources and political power and that type of stuff. I'm not downplaying how important it is. I don't want to see America step back from the world stage. And Russia, Prussia did not become powerful by stepping back from the world stage either.
No,
if
anything, it jumped in.
Yeah, they did expand. They did become an empire, but they did so in a particular order. They recognize that there are necessary prerequisites and that if you try to expand without becoming internally strong first, you're setting yourself up either for failure or, if due to luck or something you succeed, for a very unstable civilization that could collapse if challenged.
Very powerful stuff going on here. I believe, is there anything else that we're missing?
I think we've covered most of it. Obviously, this is a topic that people have written books and books about.
Of course.
We could have several podcasts about this. We could have a podcast about just World War I or just Frederick the Great, or heck, we could have a podcast about one battle if we really wanted to. But we felt like it'd be good to dive into Prussian history because, as somebody who studies the German language as my minor, Deutsch ist mein Nebenfach, ja. Und spricht ein bisschen Deutsch, aber nicht viel. But yeah, so as somebody who studies the German language and who's very interested in German history, And as somebody who's a political science major who sees how powerful Germany is becoming economically now, especially with the EU and with their large manufacturing base and stuff. I think the history of Prussia is something that's really important that we understand, and it's fun to talk about, and it's really fascinating.
And for me, it's in a similar light. Although I don't study German, I don't study the language of the Deutsch. I studied politics and international affairs through the economic side, and also how do I put this? I am a nerd for history, I tell everybody. I love history. It's not a minor or a major of mine, but I have loved it since I was young. I mean, I'm still young, but basically when I was a kid.
Yeah, so we hope this podcast was informative. We hope that you know a little bit more about Prussia than you did before you started watching this. And that's all we have to say. All right, thanks for watching, and for wisdom, virtue, and victory.
Auf Wiedersehen.
Auf Wiedersehen.